Most people think consciousness appears inside the universe. But what if the universe appears inside consciousness? That doesn't mean the universe isn't real. It means it isn't out there in the way we assume. The universe you experience is never observed from nowhere. It's observed from here, from a position, from a body, from the limits of what awareness can hold at once. There is no view from outside the observer. There never has been. Every star, every law, every history arrives already resolved, not chosen but stabilized by the structure that receives it. Reality doesn't enter consciousness complete. It becomes definite through it. And this isn't mystical. It's architectural. What you experience as the universe is the portion of reality that can be held together by an observer or by a civilization at any given depth. That's why reality feels solid when meaning is dense and unstable when it thins. Long before Rome was attacked, before it fractured, and long before it transformed into what would later become the Vatican, the collapse had already begun. Not in the streets, not at the borders, but in meaning. Gold became silver, silver became bronze. Value didn't disappear, it diluted. The philosopher wasn't expelled from politics, he was quietly excluded. Debate didn't end, it narrowed. Democracy didn't collapse into chaos, it softened into supremacy. Order without dialogue, power without reflection. Nothing looked broken. The streets were full, the rituals continued. The empire still called itself Rome, but Rome no longer agreed on what Rome was. A few sensed it, most adapted, and that adaptation, that quiet accommodation to thinning of meaning, is where collapse actually begins. Because civilizations don't fall when structures break, they fall when shared meaning can no longer stabilize reality, when the same symbols no longer produce the same world. Reality feels solid when meaning is dense. And when that density erodes, the world doesn't shatter, it loosens from the inside. When shared reality begins to loosen, force has usually not yet appeared. Force arrives later. The rupture occurs earlier, at the level of meaning. Reality does not unravel when people disagree, it destabilizes when shared meaning is severed. At that point, coordination fails, not socially, structurally. Symbols bind consciousness. They determine what matters, what does not, who belongs, who threatens, and where attention must rest. As long as symbols bind to shared meaning, reality remains coherent, even when it is strained, unequal, or unstable. When those bindings are severed, the world no longer resolves itself cleanly. Language fractures before action does, always. Words narrow, ambiguity collapses, emotion replaces interpretation. This is not cultural drift, it is perceptual disconnection. Early Nazi Germany reveals this mechanism with disturbing precision, not because of what followed, but because of what emerged first. Before policy, there were slogans. Before enforcement, emotional certainty. Before violence, symbolic compression. Language stopped functioning as explanation and began functioning as sorting. People were no longer addressed as individuals, they were sorted into categories. Symbols were deployed to collapse complexity. A symbol at this level does not invite evaluation, it instructs orientation. Once that orientation stabilizes, perception changes. Events no longer arrive as open signals, they arrive pre-resolved. Enemy, ally, threat, purity. At this stage, control does not require demands. Orders dissolve into habits, compliance becomes routine, alignment becomes daily behavior. Debate no longer appears neutral, it begins to feel unjust, destabilizing, and even dangerous. The fracture reveals itself not through chaos, but through tightening. Rules multiply, boundaries harden, deviations acquire more moral weight. This is the moment when authority recognizes something critical. Not that it has lost power, but that it has lost automatic coherence. This is the moment when authority realizes that consciousness has value. Not economic value, not military value, structural value. Because gold can be debased, borders can be redrawn, armies can be assembled, but shared perception, once fractured, cannot be brought back, only enforced. Force becomes necessary when meaning no longer stabilizes reality, not as a first option, but as a substitute, an attempt to compensate for coherence that no longer arises naturally. From the inside, this does not feel extreme. It feels ordinary, responsible, necessary. This is the danger of symbolic fracture. It does not announce itself as collapse. It announces itself as clarity. And once clarity replaces complexity, reality does not slow down. It accelerates, not into chaos, but into compression, into a world that feels increasingly stable, increasingly simplified, and increasingly difficult to exit. Certainty arrives before truth. Wisdom arrives later, only after both truth and falsehood are discovered to exist beneath the same comfort. Because certainty does not ask much of the mind, it simplifies. Where one story offers relief, another feels chaotic, unresolved, even threatening. And under pressure, the mind does not seek accuracy, it seeks rest. This is where the compression begins. Compression is not collapse through destruction, it is collapse through reduction. The world becomes easier to hold when fewer interpretations are allowed. Cognitive load drops, ambiguity recedes, decisions feel cleaner. Belonging replaces uncertainty, and belonging feels stabilizing. This is not weakness, it is physiology. A nervous system under sustained pressure will always prefer coherence, even if that coherence is narrow. This is why certainty spreads faster than truth. Truth requires integration, certainty requires alignment. In accelerated Nazi Germany, this phase unfolded rapidly. Not as fantasism, but as relief. People felt oriented again. They felt placed. The world no longer demanded constant interpretation. Symbols carried the weight of meaning so the mind did not have to. Belonging replaced doubt. Clarity replaced complexity. Mental effort decreased, and that reduction felt merciful. That relief is the danger, because what feels like coherence is not the broadening of awareness, it is the restriction of it. What feels like unity is often compression, the narrowing of possible thought, possible futures and possible selves. Free will does not disappear all at once, it compresses. Choice is reduced to alignment, curiosity becomes risk, complexity becomes threat. This is where sovereignty forgets its name, and only outside compression, only when awareness is allowed to decompress, does sovereignty remember itself. This is the quiet cost of certainty. The need to feel right replaces the capacity to remain open. But right and wrong are not opposites. They are two sides of the same equation, resolved differently depending on how much complexity the observer can hold. Compression does not feel like loss. It feels like order. It feels like safety. It feels like finally knowing where you stand, which is why it spreads, and why it is so difficult to reverse. Because once the world becomes simple enough to feel stable, the idea of reopening it feels dangerous, not to power, but to the self. This is how symbolic tension hardens into lived reality, not through fear alone, but through the quiet addiction to relief. And once enough minds settle into the same compressed frame, reality does not merely accelerate, it begins to lock into systems that feel permanent, self-evident, impossible to imagine otherwise. If you've ever wondered how intelligent people can live in opposite realities, this is the mechanism. The deepest mystery isn't ignorance, it's containment. How intelligence can live inside a self-imposed enclosure, one that slowly tightens, restricting instead of expanding. What looks like coherence from the outside is often a quiet phase lock, not to truth, but to a reality that has become internally complete. Reality doesn't persist because it is accurate. It persists because it is coherent. This is what the Cold War revealed with brutal clarity. Two worlds occupied the same planet and resolved it in entirely different ways. Children were educated differently, not simply taught facts, but trained in relevance. Scientists were praised differently, not for discovery itself, but for discovery that strengthened the internal logic of the system. Futures were imagined differently. One world dreamed of dominance through expansion, the other through control. Each side saw itself as rational, each side saw the other as deluded, and both were right, from the inside. Schools did not teach knowledge, they reinforced orientation. To question was not curiosity, it was disobedience. The skill being cultivated was not understanding, but reinforcement. To strengthen the system, not to liberate the mind. What felt intuitive was often compulsion, the pressure toward uniformity within the structure. Discovery was welcomed only when it tightened coherence. To question the frame itself was a threat to the regime, and so inquiry became treason unless it could be repurposed as utility. This is how coherence governs time. The past is rewritten to justify the present is stabilized to protect the future, and the future is narrowed until it feels inevitable. This is not failure, it is how large systems remain stable. Reality does not collapse around truth, it collapses around coherence. And coherence is powerful. It forms civilizations, it aligns millions of minds, it creates order where chaos would otherwise dominate. But coherence also has a shadow, because the same mechanism that stabilizes reality can imprison it. This is where the old myths become instructive. Angels were never just beings, they were limits, thresholds beyond which certain states could not pass, as if some structures pulled perception toward higher order, toward integration, where distortion could no longer survive. Once the system locks too tightly, movement stops, and darkness doesn't need to attack. It simply waits for rigidity to finish the work. This is a duality most people miss. From one side of the fence, the other looks insane. From the fence itself, both sides are revealed as part of the same mechanism. Two wings, one bird. Liberation does not belong to either extreme. It exists in the narrow space between them, where coherence has not yet become compression, and uncertainty has not yet become collapse. This is the unsettling implication. The most dangerous realities are not the ones built on lies. They are the ones that function too well, too stable to question, too coherent to escape. And once you see this, history stops looking like a battle between right and wrong, and starts looking like a series of worlds that became so internally consistent it could no longer be imagined otherwise. If this feels unsettling, or if it feels like a quiet tension has surfaced, that isn't a flaw, it's the mechanism revealing itself. History shows that collapse rarely announces itself loudly. It begins as a subtle shift toward compulsion, toward structure, toward certainty, a quiet narrowing that feels responsible at first. COVID was not just a crisis, it was a stress test. The same virus, the same data, the same world, yet entirely different realities emerged. Not because people disagreed on facts, but because different nervous systems resolved threat differently. Time distorted, salience sharpened. What felt tolerable to one person felt unbearable to another. Some people adapted, other people barely endured. With panic came fear, with fear control. We watched two worlds converge into one constrained space. Freedom collapsed inward, movement narrowed. The roof over our heads became the sky, and the outside world, once familiar, began to feel distant, even dangerous. People weren't arguing about facts. They were defending different internal worlds. This is what pressure reveals, not ideology, but structure. And this is where the mechanism turns inward. We created social media, and now social media creates us. It amplifies coherence faster than reflection. It reinforces certainty over integration. It spreads emotional alignment at a speed the nervous system was never built to metabolize. There is no villain here, only feedback loops. Attention becomes a vote, engagement becomes reinforcement. Reality stabilizes, scroll by scroll, frame by frame. Unless this is noticed, participation becomes automatic, not because anyone is forcing it, but because coherence feels safer than uncertainty. You don't control reality, but you are helping decide which version survives. And that brings everything back to the present moment, to the observer, not as blame, not as warning, as awareness. What kind of world is your attention helping to stabilize right now?